Okay, who's seen this before? Okay, great. So some wise people have seen this. What is this? What is this?
A map of Indigenous communities around Australia?
Yeah, very good. It's a map of Aboriginal Australia and Torres Strait Islander Australia, because we've got some Torres Strait Islands up there. What makes this map so different from the other maps that we're so used to in Australia today? What makes it different? Yeah, so it's sectioned differently, so there's not states and territories. There's lots of groovy colour in it. Yep. What else? It's actually a map, it's a representation, if you like, of how diverse Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia is. People sort of think that Aboriginal people are this one big, homogenous, happy family, all related to each other, which I think is partly true. But we're as different from the east as we are from the west, as we are from the north, as we are from the south, and the mob in the middle are completely different altogether again. There's around about 300 different distinct groups that are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And when non-Aboriginal people came here, they did not recognise that diversity. And in fact, one of the things that they did was that they referred to our beautiful place as terra nullius. Now, what does terra nullius mean? Think about it, like you mob a health mob, right? So what does terra nullius mean in the Latin sort of and Greek derivatives? Lands, terra, yeah, so terra forma, terracotta, land, earth. Okay, so land, nullius. What does that sound like it should?
Is it a land that belongs to no one?
Yeah, it literally means land that belongs to no one, and that's how it was interpreted. So the legal fiction of this place, from the first day a white foot fell on this land and claimed it as their own, they said this place belongs to nobody, to no person. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But I put this up to give people a bit of an idea of how diverse our country is. Joan acknowledged the traditional owners of this beautiful place. I also add my voice to that, so thank you very much for saying that. And I have to also disclose who I am in context and where I come from. These are two of my grandmothers. One of my grandmothers comes from a place across the border from here, not far away actually, just across the mountains, Wiradjuri lands. And there's a lot of Wiradjuri people in Canberra. So if you've ever seen the Wiradjuri dancers, well, they're people that are Smiths and they're sort of related to my mob. And my other grandmother comes from the far north coast of New South Wales, up on the Dungadi lands and the Bundjalung lands. Okay, so two of my grandmothers are Aboriginal. I obviously have a blended history, genetically, if you like. I've got a Welsh granddad, and his name was Llewellyn. Way waste a good name. And the other one was a Scotsman. And he had multiple names, including Campbell and McGregor and, you know, who knows what. But yeah, so I'm proudly standing here as a child of the world, fiercely Aboriginal, and don't anyone forget it. So, when whitefellas first came here, terra nullius was the norm. And so there's the assumption then that there wasn't anyone here, or there were very few people here. And when whitefellas came, they made some calculations about how many people were here, and it was very few. And so they didn't think that counting them or caring for them, particularly in the 1800s, meant anything important. But my colleagues and I have done some enumeration backwards, and we've found that there were between 750,000 and 1.5 million Aboriginal people here in 1788. Now that's a lot of people, don't you think? 1.5 million people. How many people live in Canberra? Is it that many? No. Even Canberra, if you put all the people in Canberra in one great big huge room, it's still not the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or Aboriginal people that were here on the mainland at that time. And this map gives you an indication of how spread out the people were. I know you can't see that very well, but most people lived around the coast, and each of these grey dots represent proven habitation on archaeological evidence of people staying in a place in excess of 100 people. Right, so that gives you an idea that there isn't a place in Australia that Aboriginal people don't know, and there isn't a place in Australia that don't have Aboriginal people on it, ever. all right? So it's really important to pay attention to simple things like that. When the Europeans came, of course, there was a great deal of dispersion. People moved from their traditional lands. A lot of the time they were chased off. A lot of the time they were poisoned out of area. Has anyone ever been in southern New South Wales and gone near a river or a place called Poison Waterhole? There's a lot of really telling names in Australia's geography. Gin Leap is another one. And these are places that have been named after famous massacres. Right, so Poison Waterhole is where some of my grandmother's parents and siblings were killed because they poisoned the waterhole and the people went to drink, and the animals died and the people died, right? So it's been properly named, I think, so at least people can remember it. But a lot of people don't recognise that when you see these crazy names, they actually mean something historically. And so there was a great deal of movement of people away from their country. A lot of them were put onto missions. They were put into prescribed places. They weren't permitted to be able to move off those missions and prescribed places. Their diets changed overnight. So suddenly people went from a lifestyle where they hunted and gathered and had seasonal foods morning, noon and night, all the way through to getting foods that were delivered in a sack, and it was usually stuff like flour and salt and sugar and tea, tobacco, sometimes rum. And so the diet overnight changed. And so of course the health of the people changed because all of a sudden now people are eating these carbohydrate-rich foods but not at the same time having the activities that would safely get rid of a lot of those carbohydrates. So what happens then? If you're overindulging in complex carbohydrates, what starts happening to you? Yeah, you start gaining weight. And what happens if you don't exercise or move around or burn them off? Belly fat starts to rise. It's all very, very simple. And it took people a long time to work out that simple fact, but we all knew that, right? Crazy folk. Anyhow, so when we start looking at population bubbles, again, we're starting to see Aboriginal people urbanising significantly. And of course, they're urbanising in the large population centres. Does anyone know where all the Aboriginal people live in Australia today? Where? Scattered everywhere? Okay, all right. Where else? Is there a main place where people live nowadays? In the cities, yeah, absolutely. Highly urbanised environments. When I go overseas and ask that question, people say, oh, the Northern Territory. All the Aboriginal people live in the Northern Territory. Lots of Aboriginal people live in the Northern Territory. A lot more live in a place called Blacktown, Sydney. Seriously. The largest proportion of Aboriginal people in this country now live in the urban western suburbs of Sydney and southwestern suburbs of Sydney. Number 3 is around the southern area of Brisbane. The vast majority are between Brisbane and Sydney on the coast and in the suburbs of those two cities. The highest proportion of people, when you can contrast numbers of Aboriginal people versus numbers of non-Aboriginal people, is the Northern Territory. But the population is still very small. And this is actually what it looks like today. So you can see by those dots the concentration is especially around Sydney and up that coast and down that coast. And you're seeing a larger population here in Canberra. It's a very large population of Aboriginal people here now. So at the moment we're residing statistically around about 3%. Does anyone know how many people are in Australia who are of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander background? Do you want to hazard a guess? The Australian population is about 23 million. So if we're about 3%, what does that look like? I can see the brains going. Everyone's going, oh, I want to just reach that calculator now. But yeah, it's around about, and you're right to say about 600,000, quick and dirty. The ABS is thinking it's probably a little bit more than that. I personally think that it's a lot more than that. The statistics or the census that we collect, we ask everybody that question. Are you of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent? The majority live in urban areas, as we've already talked about. And you tend to get poorer the further out you live. So people who are living in a place like Sydney tend to be a little bit better off and earning a little bit more money per household than those that are living elsewhere in the remote and the regional areas. But that they're poorer on monetary terms doesn't mean necessarily that people are healthier. And we did a little bit of research a few years ago where we tested the idea that Aboriginal people in the urban environment are just as disadvantaged as non-Aboriginal people in the urban environment. Actually, the question was around the other way. Non-Aboriginal people in the urban environment are just as disadvantaged as Aboriginal people in the urban environment. We thought, okay, well, let's test it. So we did a little series of trials where we matched women to age living in the same postcode area that had just confined and delivered a well live infant. Okay, so this is study design, all right? We followed those women up and those infants up, and the Aboriginal group, the so-called richer Aboriginal women, still fared worse on their health outcomes and the outcomes of their infants than the so-called poor white women. Okay, does that make sense? Really important to note that even though we say something like this, that socio-economic disadvantage increases the more remote you become, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing real well even though you're staying in the city. Okay, so this is an important thing to note. We know Aboriginal people are overrepresented on all the indicators that you can imagine, as well as being underrepresented in education, employment, home ownership, and all of those other things that a really rich country like Australia should be able to offer all of her citizens. When we start looking at population pyramids, and the new ones are being released at the moment, but I checked them out yesterday and they're very similar kinds of shapes. The non-Indigenous population is quite big. It's smeared over all of the age categories. Large proportion of people living to ripe old ages, way over 80, way over 90. There's actually a big bleep now in the 100 plus category. And next time I come and see you, I'll bring the new population pyramids and you'll see 85 plus. Very, very big number of people living long, physically healthy lives. This is when non-Aboriginal people die, usually at the end of their lives. That usually gets a laugh. What's wrong with you people? Is it too early? No. No, people die at the end of their lives after they've, done lots. Unfortunately, more and more are dying with dementia, so they don't even know that they're dying. But and it's pretty rough. But and you see that women tend to live longer than men on this. Have you met one of these things before? Yeah. Okay. So public health people are, we love our population pyramids. This is the Aboriginal population. Okay, and so that looks more like a population pyramid because it's that shape, right? So what do you see there? What's really characteristic about that? High infant mortality. Well, this is just the population one, so we're not looking at mortality yet, but you can make that assumption because of that glip. You're absolutely right. So yes, you can read that. But at a population level, what are you recognising about this?
It's less number of older elderly.
Yep, so it thins out a lot up the top, doesn't it? Yep. Okay, what else are you noticing?
The older people are breeding more.
The older people are breeding more? Okay, well...
Well, there's a lot of kids.
Yep, there's a lot of kids. So our mean age, or the average age of an Aboriginal person in Australia today is about 21. Right? So it's about 21. If we go back and look at this pyramid here, what's the mean age there? It's closer to 40. Okay, so on average, the population of non-Indigenous people is middle-aged. Population of Aboriginal people is certainly not middle-aged. It is young, very large proportion. In fact, 5% of all children in Australia are Aboriginal children. Even though we're 3% of the population, 5% of all children across the country are identified as Aboriginal. So that says something. Now, this is when Aboriginal people die. Right, so coming back to your mortality, young lady at the back. So this is it. Look at this. Now, that is a crime. Okay, that is anti-human rights. That's a bad thing. We have the richest woman in the whole wide world in our midst, and we can still have infants dying. This is a pattern of a third world country. This is a pattern of a country that is in a developing nation. This is not a pattern that's consistent with any first world nation in the world. Yet we have it in our population, in our First Nation people. And remember, most people live in the urban environment, so no one can argue this is because people don't have access to services. A lot of these infants that die live around the corner from big hospitals. So what's going on? This is shocking. This is shocking. It's really important for you as public health people to start to try and sit with this and make sense of it. And tell me when you do, because I can't make sense of it yet. But it's pretty shocking. Look, we have this huge bleep in mortality here at 30, 35. A lot of our young men get cardiac disease at that age and they drop dead. And they're often footballers and really fit guys, and they suddenly, bang, stop. Cardiovascular disease, undiagnosed. Huge cholesterol disease. You know, coronary artery blockages, bang, they're gone. You know, women die in childbirth. It's unacceptable. You know, our babies die, our kids die. Our young people, of course, there's many young people unfortunately do silly things, but our young people also die of things that aren't their fault. But what I do like seeing though is the increasing number of our people that are getting up into these extreme ages. And yesterday I noticed that we've got many centenarians in Australia, so it's many Aboriginal people who are over 100 years old. So can you imagine the stories that they could tell if you ever sat down with one of them? Right, absolutely remarkable. And when we start looking at death rates, we see that all Australian is the index, right? So that's the comparative figure that we look at. If you're born overseas, you're generally going to be healthier than people in Australia. If you're a rich person born overseas, you're healthier again. And coming back the other way, if you live outside the major cities, so if you live in the regional or rural area, you tend to not be quite as well, so you've got more death rates. If you're poor, you've got more death rates. But if you're Aboriginal, you've got the highest of all, and that doesn't matter where you live. It's going to be higher bar no population. Is everyone following this? Beautiful. It's important. And when we start thinking about closing the gap and looking at the gaps and the various other gaps, and I know this data only goes up to 2003, but if you continue it along, what you still constantly see is life expectancy in the non-Aboriginal population continues to rise, which is a great thing, right? Way back in 1850, the life expectancy of your average Australian was about 50. So we've come a long way, and it's really cool to see a baby, you know, that's born today, and the vast majority of them are going to hit 100. Right? It's amazing. It's a beautiful thing. But we're not seeing that translated into the Aboriginal population here in Australia. Okay. So no matter which way you look at it, the Aboriginal population is not getting the same benefits in life expectancy as the non-Indigenous population. So when we start looking at closing gaps on life expectancy, it's not going to happen in one generation unless we do one or two things. One, we play with the figures and make the figures different, use a different method for enumerating people and calculating life expectancy, which of course, for any statisticians in the room, it's the wrong thing to do. The second thing, and this is probably ethically incorrect and politically incorrect for me to say so, is to make white people sick. That usually elicits another laugh. What's wrong with this group? They've got no funny buttons. What's wrong? No, but seriously, that's the only way we're going to do it. So in other words, we're not going to be able to do it unless something radically changes. And I don't know what that is, but we have to start thinking very, very carefully about what we do and how we do it. When we look at kids, there's about 200,000 Aboriginal kids, and as I said before, it's 5% of the population. When you look at kids under the age of 15, that represents about 40% of the Aboriginal population as well. So not only is our average age about 21, right, but the vast majority of those kids, or the vast numbers of those kids, are still in school. So this is a really important population to start thinking about in terms of public health and the sorts of interventions that you fellas are going to be responsible for in a few years' time. And the population's going to keep growing, right? There's no doubt about that. When we start looking at education and how it is we acknowledge transitions across the lifestyle, we know that in the life cycle, most Aboriginal people have not had access to formal or informal education. Now, when I say formal and informal, they're clearly different things, right? So what's formal education? Yeah, so it's schools, it's coming to university, it's going to TAFE and college, you know, radio, school, whatever. What's informal education? You have to speak up. From their culture. So it's cultural education, that's right. So it's things like grandmother's knowledge, it's stuff that you do when you sit at home with kids and read stories to them, it's when you start teaching them dance and ceremony and song. That's all informal education. Now, a lot of people seem to somehow think that a lot of informal education happens in the home across all of our populations. Now, thinking back to your childhood, it may have happened. But there will be people in this room where that didn't happen either. So the assumption that people have access to formal education that somehow picks up what's missed in the school is not right, and it's certainly not right for Aboriginal people. And what we do know also is that other fourth world peoples, like those people who come from New Zealand, Aotearoa, which is just across the ditch, the Māori mob, the people from Canada, the people from America, the people from Hawaii, and other countries that are just like us, have got very, very different population pyramids, very, very different life expectancy. Again, I have to note that sometimes the way that's collected in those other countries is not up to standard and is not very good. In Australia, we've got a very good picture of what's going on here. Although our methods aren't really perfect yet, they're a lot better than they have been, so we can say a lot about it. Those other countries I just mentioned actually have a lot more life statistics data. And when we start looking at what that looks like, you see a bunch of lines going along here. Well, what these are the lines that represent the Māori in New Zealand, the people who are Indigenous in the United States, and the people who are Indigenous in the country of Canada. And you can see that from a long time ago, 1972, they started collecting all of these statistics, and you can see that there's been a gradual increase in life expectancy over time, right? So the curve's going up. What we've got here is the average Australian life expectancy for non-Indigenous people, and that was since about the 1980s. That's been collected, and you can see that gradually climbing up as well. That's a good thing. But we haven't been collecting information in a meaningful way for Aboriginal people, and it was really only the early 90s that we started doing so. The early 90s. Now that's not very long when you start thinking about Australia having a very, very long history of census collection, right? And so what we see though when we start looking at this is that we don't see much shift in the 90s and the early noughties in life expectancy for Aboriginal people. And we're starting to see a bit of a shift. Things are improving, not quite as much as we'd like and as we'd hoped, but we still nevertheless are seeing things change. When we start looking at life expectancy specifically for the non-Indigenous people of Australia, and so this is all the people excluding Aboriginal people, at the moment life expectancy is in the 80s for non-Indigenous people, and you can see, as I said before, you know, back in the 1800s it was 50, and you can see this gradual rise of people getting healthier and fitter, and that's in part to good public health practices. I mean, we've done stuff about seat belts, we've done stuff about cardiovascular disease, about all of the big chronic diseases. You know, you've got pills you can take, generally speaking, that'll keep you alive a lot longer than what used to happen. But when we look at the Aboriginal population on the next slide, you can see that the current Indigenous population life expectancy is somewhere around the 40s and the 50s. So that's the middle of last century. Okay, so it's a really big deal. And that's the number, and they're the measures that we rely on to help convince governments and other funders that particular attention needs to be paid to this. Now, we could be doing this in Canada, we could be doing this in America, we could be doing this in Hawaii, and although the numbers would be different, there's still gaps. And that there's a gap is unacceptable in any of our nations, so it's really important to pay attention to that. And sometimes people say, well, how come? You know, what's going on? And one of the things that we start looking at is this whole area of social determinants of health. Now, have you done any lectures on that yet? Oh, great, there's all these smiles. Look, see, now they're reacting here. Social determinants of health, really important things. People sort of say, oh, it's all soft science. It's not. It affects people's health. Here's one way of looking at it. Aboriginal people, or all people, were asked whether or not they live with high or very high, with levels of distress. And a lot of people don't live with levels of distress. So I'm only showing you the metric against, or the results of high and very high distress levels as reported, right, in a census, in a health collection. What we find is young people, 10 or 15% of non-Indigenous young people live with very high levels of distress. Aboriginal people, over a third of our young people live with levels of high distress. And you can see this figure all across the lifespan. Even very old people still live with very high levels of distress. Now that affects your health. So can you imagine if you're going through a really hard time, what starts to happen to your body? You start to get crook, you might get more colds, get a sore throat, you feel a bit miserable, you don't want to go out and exercise, you start eating all those really yummy things called chocolates and other therapeutic medicines, right? Some people start drinking a lot, you know. So people do behaviours that are not useful for them when they're feeling these sorts of levels of distress. Now, if you're living that through your lifetime, what happens? You're not well. And it's amazing how people's bodies can be resilient against distress, how resilience can allow people to survive and thrive. But sometimes there's just one tiny extra little wafer popped on top of the load and that sends people off. So it's really important to recognise that it's a really big deal. This is a picture of country. Has anyone ever been up to northwestern New South Wales? Yay. Okay, who knows Brewarrina? Yep, okay, Walgett, Burke, all those beautiful places, lovely. Okay, well this is a photo that I took in 1994 on the road to Brewarrina, and it was very, very early in the morning, okay? And I was driving up there in the big health service van, because they used to give us big vans to ride off in those days. No, sorry, to drive safely between A and B. It's just me and the kangaroos, you know, we don't have a good relationship. But, and I just saw this beautiful fog and the mist was starting to lift. And you have this in Canberra a lot too, where you've got these beautiful mists and you can look across the paddocks. And I took this photo and I went up to see my family that are up there, and I said to my old uncle, I said, oh, look, you know, I took these great photos and I sent them up to him, and when I saw him next time we sat down and we talked about it, and he said, you know where that place is? And I said, yep, on the road, you know, to Brewarrina, on the dirt road between Burke and Bree. And he said, well, actually it's more than that. He said, that is my grandmother's country, and that's where I take the young boys and teach them how to be men. So that's a sacred place. And it's interesting because just beyond where that fog is, where you can't see anymore, is the men's place. I thought, oh, isn't that cool? You know, the fog went off and shielded me and my prying lens from taking a photo that I shouldn't have taken. And he was really happy I took that photo, because only a few years later there was a new politic that came into the country. There was a great deal of fear going on about Aboriginal people and how it is my uncle's people had been on that land for hundreds and hundreds of years. They could prove ongoing occupation, ongoing connection to country, and at the time the pastoralist that owns that land or that cares for that land for 200 years or whatever on a long-term lease said, well, I'm not going to let you come back onto that country and teach those kids that stuff anymore. Because if you keep doing that, you can prove connection to country and you'll take my lifestyle away from me, and I've been here for 100 years and blah, blah, blah. So it ended up being a big fight. And so the next time I came along there, what was surrounding this land? Yep, barbed wire fence. And guess what signs are on it? Large friendly letters. Trespassers will be shot on sight. I looked at it, I thought, oh bugger, I'm going to keep driving real fast, you know, another van goes. But, you know, this is what happened. And so that old man, he died a few years later. And Aunt said that he died because he couldn't take the kids back there. Because someone in Canberra had said, if Aboriginal people can prove ongoing connection to country, you'll lose your land. Now, it was a stunt. It was absolutely a political stunt, but it had a very serious effect. And I would claim today that it's probably harmed a lot more people than Uncle Eugene Biles, right? So it's really important that when we're dealing with stuff around Aboriginal health, that there are a lot more factors than, you know, just someone's blood pressure or their blood tests or what you see in a scanner, okay? There's a whole story that's around that. And I reckon if I sat down with any of you fellas, I would get the same thing out of you mob, right? Yeah, because you've all got a story, which is important. So we know that non-Indigenous lives were improved with social changes, the social determinants of health, the new public health and all the groovy stuff that happened, especially stuff around improving education. Now, women in this country have only recently had to go through mandated education in high school. Right. When I started nursing in the 70s, we weren't even paid the same amount. The public service, and some of the old ladies here will laugh at this one, because you know, the public service when you got married in the 70s and 80s, you had to leave your job. Seriously. Ask your mothers, you girls, yeah? But it's true. And so we sort of claim to be, the great leader in the OECD and the country with this great human rights record. But I tell you, it's, scratch under the surface, there's a few things to learn. We've come a long way, but we've got a long, long way to go. But what we do know about Aboriginal people is that we've been here for a long, long time. My grandmothers say, 60,000 years. Nah, longer than that. I say, how long? They say, since the beginning of time. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems a lot longer than 60,000 years. But, we've got a whole model of health in this country that developed from the ground, about holism and what holistic health means. And it's beyond what the physical illness is, it's beyond social and emotional well-being, it's beyond the health of the individual, it's beyond the health of the community. It's all of these things together. All of these things together. And these are critically important in understanding what it means to be a practitioner and having really good practice in the context of Aboriginal health in this country. And do not be mistaken, these principles that you're learning here in this lecture today and that you'll continue to learn over the years of your degree will be things that you'll be able to translate in any environment around the world, right? A lot of the students I teach in other programs are international students, and a lot of them do the Aboriginal health stuff. Why? Because there's translatable learnings and principles in their home countries and states. Okay, so just recognise this. This is not a very narrow field. Okay, if you can get this right for Aboriginal people, if you can get your thinking right for Aboriginal people in this country, in this context at this time, you'll get it right no matter what population of people you work with in this country or elsewhere. Does that make sense? So the disparities that we're learning about today, if you get it right here, it'll be able to be embraced and inclusive of all the disparities that you're going to come across in your practice. All right? So, something happened in 2008, can you remember? It was the first K-Rudd Prime Ministership. He apologised. Who was here then? Do you remember where you were? Do you remember the tears, the tissues, the crying, the outward grief and joy, the huge expectations? Oh my gosh, it was a big day. My old mum, she'd say to me things like, mum's a bit of a dag, she'd say things like, my mum's Aboriginal, my kids are Aboriginal. And one day I said to her, what about you, mum? She said, don't be silly. Are we adopted? She said, no, don't be silly. She used to get really indignant. But after Rudd and Brendan did their speeches on that day, she rang me up. And she was crying. My mum, she's tough, she's a really tough old lady. And she said, I wish mum was alive to have heard that. And she's since joined her local Aboriginal Land Council. And she's since started saying, and in the last census she ticked Aboriginal box. I thought, wow, that's really cool. She's only 83. I mean, she's getting there. But it took that long for her to feel safe to be able to do that. So now she's registered Aborigine at the local AMS, now she gets the well person's health checks and all of those additional checks. And, it's amazing what happens when the word sorry occurs and it's genuine and heartfelt. And I do believe on that day the spiritual fibre of this country changed because our politics said that. Right? Really important day. But interestingly, I think what happened the day before was probably more significant. Does anyone know what happened the day before the formal apology? Yeah, no, most people don't. I get really amazed at this. What happened is a whole stack of elders came together and they gathered in the Great Hall at the Parliament House that joined up on the hill, and they did a welcome to country. And all of the women and the men who were there welcomed for the first time the Parliament of Australia, therefore all of the people of Australia. And one of the elders did a speech, and in part of that speech she said, I want to welcome all who have come, all who are here and all who will come. Now, for those of you who know anything about Aboriginal protocols, it's really important, this whole welcome to country thing. It's not just about a guy with a didgeridoo and a bit of clap-sticking and dance. It's a sacred spiritual ceremony that's been going on for a very, very long time. It's an exchange of rules and laws. It tells you how to behave on country. It tells me where I can go, where I can't go. And this was extended to all Australians. And so there was this incredible forgiveness that came through in this welcome to country that said, all of you here now belong. All of you here now belong. And so that means that no longer can we continue to say it's up to the government to fix Aboriginal health, or it's up to the government to do this, or it's up to someone else to do that. It's all of our responsibilities because of that welcome to country. And it's really important that we start to address that and understand what that means, because as people who have been welcomed, I mean, I've got white people in my family as well, they've been welcomed, they all have a responsibility. So it's not just up to a few small voices anymore, it's up to every single voice in this country. And interestingly, just a few days ago, with the new election, we've got another new beginning, because now the Prime Minister Abbott has appointed one of the Mundine men, who was formerly the Labor Party president in New South Wales, to head up a new group that's looking after Indigenous affairs, and it's going to be placed solidly in PM&C, Prime Minister's and Cabinet's offices. It's the highest bureaucratic office in the country. So they are going to be charged now with the responsibility of caring for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander matters. Now, I don't know where that's going to go. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm hoping it's a good thing, because that means that someone's got the voice and the ear of the new Prime Minister. And it's up to us, all of us, to keep these fellas to account. This is Abbott up in Garma Festival earlier this year, up in the top end, which is a really good thing to get to if you ever get a chance. So I think there's a new beginning. But despite what the new beginnings are, the job is still for many of us to grow Aboriginal people into doing what it is they want to do. And here's a photo of a bunch of people that I work with on scholarship programs. I've got 55 Aboriginal medical students in my program at UNSW. We've got 350 Aboriginal students living on campus now at UNSW, doing things from degrees, undergraduate degrees in science, social work, law, medicine, optometry, business, economics, you name it. This is a couple of them, just to give you an idea of how seriously this is. These kids are changing the academy, and any Aboriginal person in this academy as well is changing the academy for the better. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that photo. Public health is one of those things that we always like to talk about in the context of things that we can do. Aboriginal people are smokers. 50%. About 50%, yep. The largest cohort of people uptaking smoking in this country are young Aboriginal women. What's the big problem with that? Other than it does not look sexy, it does not look groovy, and it's really uncool. But then again, I'm old, so I can say that. So what's the big deal with young Aboriginal women taking up smoking, given what we've just learned earlier in this presentation? Smoking and pregnancy gives a lady a Tim Tam. No, but it's true, smoking and pregnancy. We've done a lot of work around why do people take up smoking. Those of you who are smokers or were smokers, you know, it's really complicated, the reasons why people do it. You know, I know that when I started smoking, I couldn't tell you now why I started. I can tell you why I stopped, and I can tell you how hard it was, and I'd wish I'd never started. But then again, you know, but smoking and pregnancy is a real issue. What happens to babies? When you've got a baby in here and you're smoking, what happens to your baby? What? Respiratory problems? Yep. Good. What else? Someone else said something over here. What else happens with your baby that's growing? Think about it.
Doesn't it cause low birth rates?
Yep, low birth weights, absolutely. And that's under 2,500 grams, which is quite small. What else? What else happens?
Do they go through withdrawals?
Well, no, not so much, we don't think. But I think that's a study that should be done, because I would find it hard to believe that, you know, a child wouldn't go through some sort of nicotine disconnect. Yep.
Aren't there high-risk SIDS as well?
Much higher risks of SIDS, not only for mums who smoked, but if mums smoke, there's a good chance there's environmental tobacco smoke, and that's a much higher risk for SIDS as well, so the kid's got a double whammy to start with. What else? Yes? Yes, so ongoing respiratory conditions occur for little babies whose mums are smokers. We did some really interesting research, and we wanted to find out, and this is research around breastfeeding. Wanted to find out why Aboriginal mums, you know, what would help them breastfeed, what stops them from breastfeed, all that stuff. One of the things that we found is that the mothers would say, I smoke and I know smoking's bad for my infant, so I've cut it down during pregnancy, and we go, yeah, good. I want to breastfeed because breastfeeding's good for my baby. Yeah, that's good, you know, like this is great. It doesn't really balance each other out, but you know, it's good. But, you know, I think what I'll do is I'll bottle feed my baby because I don't want to hurt my baby with smoking, right? So people go off and rationalise and justify why they don't breastfeed, and one of the big things is around smoking. And so if we somehow try and work really hard at intercepting the smoking pattern, we might end up with higher rates of breastfeeding. Have you guys done breastfeeding and maternal infant child health yet? Yeah. Oh, so you can just throw that at the lecturer. Oh, by the way, smoking, and they'll be really impressed. Nah. We have a lot of deaths, preventable deaths with smoking. Public health people get really fussed about preventable deaths. We would hypothesise the majority of reported deaths attributed to smoking are preventable, but these 58.8 or 60 million odd deaths are a far underestimate because you're not taking into account those people that are affected by environmental tobacco smoke. Okay, you're not taking into account that at all. And in fact, Australia's got a very famous case of a bar lady. She was she worked as a bar for many, many years and never smoker. But she ended up dying of a particularly awful type of throat cancer purely due to her job in a bar where smoking was permitted. Okay, so when people say environmental tobacco smoke doesn't hurt, well, it does. We've got lots of evidence about it, and it's something that we need to be very conscious about. Interestingly, it's mostly poor people that smoke. Right? There's not that many rich people that make that choice, so you have to wonder. Remember we were talking before about the whole idea of distress and stress in people's lives? Like, I mean, when I was young, I was a highly distressed, young, angry 14-year-old adolescent, and smoking did calm me down because I didn't have other activities and actions. I didn't have a basketball I could throw some, you know, like nowadays I do very different things about my stress, right, because I've got different options. But when you don't have options, what's the thing you do? You know, so we have to be really mindful about what that looks like and how it looks like. And it's not about vilifying the smokers, but it's about encouraging them. Yeah.
I read a study a little while back that said, because I used to be a smoker myself, that said smoking actually doesn't reduce your stress level, it actually increases it. Yeah. I think that's probably true. Again, it's the measures of physiological stress. So physiologically, it would be causing more stress. But when you're thinking of the emotional stress, one of the things when I stopped smoking, this is probably the same for you as well, is I never gave myself time out to go outside and take a few deep breaths. In my workplace, those few smokers that are left, they have permission every hour to step outside for 10 minutes and have a smoke. I don't have permission to go outside every hour to have a 10-minute break. And so I think that opportunity that was afforded to me as a smoker, just to sit outside and have a think and, you know, plan and... Stop in capital letter at the sentence.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It was an interesting contextual marker to finish and start a piece of work. And I think what we need to do is start building in better strategies so we can actually start looking at how we can balance that. So yeah, you're right. I don't think it is a stress factor, but then again, it is. Okay, so it depends what you're measuring. Good.
I was going to say the same thing.
Oh, were you? You two are connected. Okay, any other questions about that? Yeah. Is this making sense? Yeah, nod. Good for you, fellas. So it's ranked the third most addictive substance in the whole wide world. Third most addictive. Is that true? I found the hardest thing I've ever done in my whole life. I've written a PhD, you know, I've become an adult learner. I was functionally illiterate at 14 and I went to tech to learn to read and write. That was a piece of cake compared to stopping smoking, I tell you. Look what's above it, heroin and cocaine, okay? There's only two worse things. It's nearly close to methadone, right? So it's a really serious drug. Really serious drug. It should not be treated as anything more than an extremely dangerous and toxic substance. Interestingly, Tom Calmer, you know who he is here at Canberra? Yeah, really amazing guy, Commissioner Tobacco, about to take on the Chancellery at this Augusta University. One of the piece of research that he did, we all think that alcohol sort of leads to people smoking. Have you heard that one? You know, people go off to pubs and, you know, have a few drinks and they decide to have a cigarette. What Tom found was something that was almost the opposite. Heavy smokers tend to be heavy drinkers. What started first? The smoking. So the smoking, in his hypothesis, can lead to heavier levels of alcohol consumption. I really thought it was the other way around, but when you think about it, there's some sense in that. Not that I'm going to go off and test the hypothesis personally or anything, but I just thought I'd put that out there so you who are smokers or former smokers can think about that and let me know what you think. People often also say, but Aboriginal people have always had tobacco in their lives. And I suppose that's true. Most cultures have got some sort of tobacco, but it's not something that you use every waking moment of the day. It's something that's usually confined in strict ceremonies. It's used very, very infrequently, and it's certainly not something which you can pop into a packet and carry around with. So we've got lots of bush tobaccos here. And modern tobacco was introduced here when the white fellas came as a way of bargaining and trade. And as I said before, it was very much a part of rations. And you can see this young lady holding up a picture, and it says here, "Smoking stinks." And once you get community women starting to say that sort of thing, you know action's going to happen, because they're the ones that really have the control and power. We know that smoking in young people has gone down a tiny bit, but nearly half of all Aboriginal Australians today smoke, and that's just way too many. And Aboriginal Australians are 3 times more likely to smoke. Okay, so this is a public health issue. It's something that you can think about. You know, if you want to write up an assignment about this, please do. There's lots of really fabulous resources, and it's really good to start getting some quality thinking into this, because this problem's not going to go away. In your lifetime, you're going to have a huge excess mortality due to early uptake of young Aboriginal women, in particular, smoking. All right, have a glorious day. It's been nice meeting you. See ya.
Very much.